Amity Island had everything: clear skies, gentle surf, warm water. People flocked there every summer, Steve. It was the perfect feeding ground. And on this day in horror movie history in 1975, Daddy, Steven Spielberg gave us the film that made us afraid of the water again. It was Jaws. And this is Slasher Sports Cinema. I'm, of course, here with Steve Feck. Steve, some horror films make you afraid of the dark. Some make you afraid of clowns. But has any film ever made the general audience afraid to go into the water more than Jaws?
Well, no, absolutely not. And I have to admit, having grown up down the Jersey Shore, where you swim with sharks on a regular basis, where I've gone out and done shark fishing off Montauk Point, Long Island. I was at shark tournaments off of Jersey. For me, so much of it was absurd, what was going on in Jaws and all the fear, but the fear was real because in theory, at any point, a great white or other shark, tiger shark, which they tried to blame at some point in this film, could come and attack someone. But for me, who grew up on the shore and is used to seeing, sharks swimming around all the time, it was kind of like people relax. Do you have any idea what's in the water at any given time? So everybody needs to relax. But when it's on the screen and you have, corpses popping out of boat holes, now suddenly there's an extra layer of fear that gets added to the
movie magic, my man.
Yes,
Movie
absolutely.
magic. But just like my last episode on Psycho, where people just know to make the re sounds, well, when they're pretending to stab somebody, people just know the music, dum, 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 dum. It's been a staple of pop culture, and even got parodied on SNL with a shark pretending to deliver letters. The land shark, and of course the shark played by Ralph Lee, who we just lost back in May. So R.I.P. Ralph Lee. I know you have to remember the land shark and love the land shark, man.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, right. And again, and it's almost poked fun at the absurdness of Jaws, with some of the parts of Jaws, by having that. Of course, nobody candygram. Of course, there's not going to be you're going to think a shark going to come attack you if somebody has a candygram. So there's so many things that got triggered off of this film, including some bad remakes, unfortunately. But really, so many things came off of this film that we could probably talk for 2 hours about this and not cover everything.
Oh yeah, it's almost content that just keeps on contenting, But this film's about when a killer shark unleashes chaos on a beach community off Cape Cod. It's up to a local sheriff, a marine biologist, and an old seafarer, an old salty sailor, if you will, to hunt the beast down. But Steven Spielberg directed this film, and honestly, Steve Spielberg does not get a lot of attention on this show, despite being maybe arguably the greatest movie director ever lived if we poll all our movie viewers. I mean, he did direct a segment from the Twilight Zone movie and produced Poltergeist, and I believe he produced Arachnophobia. He's got a lot of horror production under his belt, but only like 4 directing credits, Steve.
And I don't know, is it because he wanted to shy away from being pigeonholed as a horror director?
He didn't do anything after like the mid 80s. He didn't. Yeah. And most of that was TV. Could maybe even be labeled suspense, if you look at it from a certain lens. But I think there's also maybe a stigma that comes along with being a horror director. And it's not like Steve Spielberg's ever going to be pigeonholed into anything, because he'd done, much more before that and after that. And nothing's going to ruin his reputation. If that, what was it, like that animated Gremlin series, if that didn't ruin his reputation, nothing's going to. Nothing is going to. But, Jaws opened, well, actually, you know what? I need to bring up something real quick, Steve. I know you're big on soundtracks and scores, but did you know that when composer John Williams originally played the score for Steve Spielberg, he laughed and said, "That's funny, John." Oh, really? What you got?
You know what? That wouldn't surprise me because, and I'm glad you brought up, Psycho. And by the way, that was a great segment that you and Suki did with that.
Thank you.
There is a lot of timelines, those little like red strings that you talk about in Japanese mythology between Psycho's soundtrack and the soundtrack that John Williams came up with for Jaws. It is really, it's not an in-your-face at most points soundtrack where it's like, wow, but you get drawn in, like you said. Everybody now knows, reap, 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 and everybody knows da-dum, da-dum. That's what really made this soundtrack so magical, is that Williams didn't try to take center stage like he sort of has to do in Star Wars and whatever the other things he does. He weaved the music into the film, not vice versa. The film, it wasn't like side by side. It's just a subtle little. It's sort of like when you add a little whiskey to your coffee. It's just subtle.
Oh,
it's just subtle.
So basically, it's the by Menon of movie
soundtracks. Yes.
Well, can we go with that?
Yeah,
I like that. Well, Jaws opened on June 20th, 1975, and it was supposed to be released in theaters for Christmas of 74, but filming ran a little bit too long, a lot too long, and it got pushed to summer the following year. Now, listen, summer is not traditionally the best time for movies. Okay, the people want to be outside on the beach, doing outdoor family stuff, having the picnic on, in the park. But the film was so good, even the beach bodies, even those hard bodies had to flock and see it, man. And it became the highest grossing film of all time up to that point. And it became the first film to gross over 100 million in theatrical rentals, which is the figure the studio nets from the box office after the theaters take their cut. So it's like really half of the box office gross. So the numbers that this thing did at the time was absolutely bananas. So the summer blockbuster does not happen without Jaws. It just doesn't happen.
Very true. Very true. And in retrospect, it makes more sense for it to come out in the summer. I understand that there was a lot of money involved, so you wanted it to be a Christmas when your biggest audiences are there. But really, as far as impact, I think I don't want to say it would have been forgotten if it was released at Christmas. But in most parts of the viewing audiences, it's 20 degrees and the water's frozen over, so you're not worrying about a shark coming up and nipping at your leg.
Yeah,
having it in the middle of the summer,
Mickey Rooney and. Came upon a midnight clear or some shit. That's
right.
Shark movies aren't what they were thinking about in the middle of December when they got icicles hanging off their earlobes. It's just not how it works. But listen, Spielberg shot about a quarter of this film from water level, Steve. Okay, and he did that to give us the perspective that we're out there floating in the water, and I do this thing, Steve, whenever I watch a film and a character goes underwater for just a few seconds, I hold my breath. And I don't know why I do that. Maybe just like my own mind's ridiculous nature saying, hey, you know what? You're underwater now. Hold your breath or you're gonna choke to death. I don't know. But it hits especially harder when my mind does that, and the film is shot at water level for a quarter of the time. There were so many things in this film that were done with the intent of putting us on the boat or in the water with those in the film. And hell, most of the film was shot handheld cam, because it kind of to counter the swell of the ocean, and that right there, that's Spielberg for you. And, had he not been the director that, ended up on this film, because he was not going to be the guy that directed this film. It was going to be Dick Richards. But Dick Richards didn't know the difference between a whale and a shark. So they had to let him go. True story. They said, we're not making Moby Dick. We can't work with somebody who doesn't know the difference between a whale and a shark. Wild thing, but it's the truth. Dick Richards could have been the guy behind Jaws, and he probably would have just had all kinds of mammals on screen, and it wouldn't have been a great white. Ridiculousness, Steve.
I mean, it's scary. I actually lost my train of thought because I can't get that out of my head. I can just see like an orca, or some kind of blue sperm whale spouting rather than it being Jaws. Rather than the body being bitten in half, it would have come out of the spout hole,
out of the blowhole.
Yeah, but
but again, because Orca did rip off Jaws, or at least some people say it ripped off Jaws. I am one who does not believe that the film Orca ripped off Jaws, but that's a conversation we can have for another day.
Well, it was derivative. I will say it was derivative. You couldn't have Orca without Jaws.
That's a fact. That's a fact. Even though, of course, you have to change elements of the story, and Orca was from the point of view of basically the orca being the good guy in the film. The orca is the protagonist. It is man who is the bad guy in Orca. But listen, Roy Scheider, iconic line, you're going to need a bigger boat. A more iconic line you will not find, Steve. But Roy Scheider only had 6 horror roles in his life. And if we come away from this film with anything else in mind, like our trigger event, I watched this film, now I have to watch this film. Well, I have to watch this film should turn into The Curse of the Living Corpse. This is Roy Scheider's debut film, where relatives gather in an old house for the reading of a will, but the dead man comes back to life and starts killing them off. Again, Scheider's debut film. As a matter of fact, all stage folks were in this film, and that makes a difference, Steve. Stage versus film. It's the biggest difference between acting for stage versus acting for screen is obviously the location of the audience, right? The audience is going to be a little further away. The film, it's right up in your face. In a theater, the audience tends to be really far away from the stage, requiring actors to exaggerate their movements, exaggerate their facial expressions and their voices. And, all the audience members have to see what's going on stage. Theater acting is hard because it requires stamina, focus. You got to work for 2 or 3 hours straight, where film acting is you get breaks in between, you get to rehearse. And
right. Well, I didn't like that take. Let me try that again. Right.
Exactly. I mean, but of course, Curse of the Living Corpse. That if you come away with any suggestions, that's the one. And I know you got a little bit to say about Robert Shaw. I mean, he's from a Man of All Seasons, The Sting, From Russia with Love. Of course, he plays Captain Quint in Jaws.
He does. And you could say he overplays it. He over emotes as a character. But I know we always talk about what works, what doesn't. What works for me is Quint overplaying that, because in real life, again, and unless you're from a shore or ocean community or a fishing community, he's not that exaggerated from guys you found on Long Island that were professional shark fishermen, or people out of Cape Cod and that whole area there, people that go out into the ocean for months at a time and then come back with whatever the thing is. So yes, right. Did he overact it? Okay, I'll give you that. But that is what those people are like.
Of course.
Right. And for me, the thing about Jaws, and again, coming from where I grew up, is that you have the old timers that always lived by the ocean and made their living from the ocean. Then you have all of these, middle class, executives who are trying to get away for the weekend and coming down there and building too close to the shore and, polluting, the docks or whatever it would be. So you have, that dichotomy there. And then you've got the scientist. You have Hooper, played by Richard Dreyfuss. So you have all 3 different factors. You've got the people that don't care. I don't care if there's an octopus /shark /nuclear submarine off the coast. It's 4th of July. It's Memorial Day. I want to be in the ocean. I want to be able to have my ice cream. I want to be able to walk the boardwalk. I don't care about anything else. So you had the dichotomy of Quint being that old, tight-fisted, I don't want all these fancy cages and blah, 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 blah. I'm going to catch this shark just like I've done the last 50 years of my life. And then you have the scientist saying, well, no, you have to remember that the behaviors of the shark is this, and you have to have the phase of the moon at the right place. and then you have the clueless people that are down at the shore, with their little white stuff on their nose and black socks and their sandals walking along the sand. That's what I really loved. I think that's what really worked for me, not only in the movie but also in the book, is you definitely had all three factors kind of pushing to the film's ultimate conclusion. What the outcome would be really was affected by each of those three entities.
Well, maybe your assessment of Robert Shaw is the reason that he was ranked number 28 on Premiere Magazine's 100 Greatest Movie Characters of All Time. And that's a real testament to skill and talent right there. And you mentioned Richard Dreyfuss, my favorite line of his as well. If we're looking for a shark, we're not going to find him on the land. Of course, that's classic Richard Dreyfuss delivery. The first Richard Dreyfuss film I ever saw was What About Bob? And that's where I fell in love with his acting. And looking back on Jaws, I said, man, that's the same guy. And I could see how everything I saw in What About Bob is just an exaggerated version of what happened in Jaws. And I absolutely love it. But if you haven't checked anything out from Richard Dreyfuss, young folks, American Graffiti, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. But I really think some of the best dialogue came from Shaw and Dreyfuss in this film because they had a tough time working together. They weren't friends, not like me and you, Steve.
No, right. And it goes back to what I was saying. I mean, there are just so many different opposites involved, in this film. You could even argue that Brody and his wife, in a lot of ways, were opposites. He was still this intense, NYPD cop that retired and is now the police chief in a small, sleepy resort town, but he still wants to be in the action. And his wife just wants to have a normal life, So there's all these dichotomies. You have the mayor who's just obsessed with the business aspect of it. He doesn't care how many people really die. Ultimately, he's weighing it on, okay, how many zeros are going to be in the bank accounts of our Chamber of Commerce, as opposed to how many people on the tally board are going to be there at the shark eat. So it's Jaws has everything, but it's so subtle. When you're watching it, you don't think about it. But then when we're going back like we are, we're talking about this film in retrospect, you look at it, and it really was not only a film of its time, because now everybody's used to the beach being built back up and everything like that. But back then it was becoming a big issue for locals. Even for me, who moved from the city to the Jersey Shore when I was young, I started getting upset that you had all these yahoos coming in from the city all the time and just throwing their sandwich in the water and the cans or whatever it is. I'm like, well, wait a minute. I swim in this, I fish in here for my dinner.
This is home.
Be doing this. Yeah. Right. So.
Well, you talked about what worked for you, Steve, and what works for me about Jaws is this isn't just a creature feature. Steve-O, no, sir. This is a genre bender of sorts, okay? The whole second half of Jaws takes place on the ocean. At least the last 50-something odd minutes of basically a 2-hour film happens on the ocean. So this is just as much an isolation horror as it is a creature feature, as it is a suspense. But this thing was carried that last half with just Roy Scheider, Robert Shaw, Richard Dreyfuss, carrying it between the three of them. No other characters appear. Of course, the shark, that was the fourth character, makes about a 4-minute appearance, which I'll get to in a second. But you can see dry land at the end of the movie, but during that 50-minute sequence, you didn't see a lot of land or any at all, because again, Spielberg, thinking about what the audience is going to consume here, he didn't want us to see the land because he knows what we're going to do. He knows we're going to ask, well, hey, if there's a shark out there trying to kill him, why don't they just skip on back to land? And that's exactly what we would do. So no, he wants to isolate the audience as much as he does the characters. And that is the mark of a genius. And Spielberg is just that. Horror or not, whether you consider Jaws a horror film or not, and a lot of people do not, I do, because of the elements. Steven Spielberg put this film together, and he did so in a way that made it somewhat of a slow burn, but you can tune in about halfway in and be in for the ride of your life. And that's what Jaws is. You want a long, slow burn, hit it from the beginning. You want that action, hit it in the middle and get ready, because that's what Jaws is. It is a horror film for horror people. It's a suspense for suspense people. It's a drama for the dramatics. And it's just, to me, one of the perfect films in horror movie history.
Absolutely. And it's situational horror. And I think that is trickier to pull off than something that, okay, you know, a Frankenstein or a Dracula back in, you know, in the early days of film, or things that you would expect, you know, Texas Chainsaw. Okay, that's obvious horror. But situational horror, I think, is a much trickier slope to try to navigate. The fact that you had, like you said, referred to the isolation and having things out on the water, that really had never been done before. You know, I mean, they might have edited things, or you had movies like PT 109, you know, about John Kennedy, you know, in the World War II, where, yeah, you see boats on the water, but, you know, everything else is on a stage, you know, a stage, a screen stage or whatever. So nobody had really ever done that before. So you're now being put in a situation. What would you do if you were out in the middle of the ocean and your boat was no longer functioning and you had this, you know, man-eating maniac out there in the water basically stalking you all the time? It's a situation that is as frightening as any sort of slasher situation would be, because you never really know what's going to happen next.
You absolutely don't. And, you know, less is more. The shark only gets about 4 to 5 minutes of screen time in this film, and that's quite all right. I once remember seeing the first of the new generation Godzilla films, and somebody hit me up and said, man, Godzilla was only in the movie for about like 15 minutes. And I'm like, that's your complaint, man? Because to me, you get overexposure to what you're supposed to be in awe of. If you see Godzilla on screen for half an hour, 45 minutes, you are no longer in awe of Godzilla when he shows up. You are not going to be in awe of the shark when, you know, well, first of all, you don't want to watch something like The Meg and then tune into Jaws and hope that you're going to just be wowed. You're not going to be wowed by the size of the shark unless you're transported back to 1975. But if you could put yourself in the place of those on the boat, and I believe you can do that because that's the picture that Spielberg paints, then you're going to be in for a very wild ride. And you can do so by either renting on Vudu, like I did. You can also find it on some subscription services like Rediscover Television, the TBS app, that you might get for free if you have cable or satellite subscription. Who knows? On Spectrum, you can check any of these apps, see which one you like the most. Now, Steve, you handsome devil, tell them where you can find you on your socials.
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Feckless Baseball, because really my real job for Slasher Sports is sports, whether it be Slash Review. I have a podcast with OK Baseball called Central Intelligence, talking about the NL Central, a topic, you know, close to both of our hearts when we're not talking about movies. But, you know, I'm generally out there annoying somebody, you know, so it's not hard to find me. I mean, if you put in Steve Feck, you're probably going to get a bunch of hate tweets about what a moron I am and things like that. I
get a 404 error every time.
It's not that, you know, I don't intend to do it. I just have that natural gift of annoying people.
Yeah, my parental filter's on my computer just to keep you off of it. That's that's how I roll. But guys, if you're looking for something to watch tonight, cue up a classic and often imitated but never duplicated horror called Jaws. And may you drink the blood of your enemies from the skulls of their children.